Sails and smoothbores to atoms and missiles. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The story of the submarine. Chapter 1. The first Portsmouth submarines, 1914 to 1918. By 1914, when Secretary of the Navy Joseph S. Daniels awarded the Portsmouth Navy Yard a government contract to build a submarine, there had long been an evolving tradition of shipbuilding in the Piscataqua area. Since the official founding of the yard in 1800, more than a century of work and experience had established a first-rate facility equipped to meet the complex demands of submarine construction. A new age of the yard had arrived. American submarines had been built in private yards since 1900. The Portsmouth Navy Yard was chosen to construct the first sub in a government facility. The yard's legacy dated from 1603, when Martin Pring, an Englishman, sailed up the Piscataqua River. In 1622, Sir Ferdinando Gorges and John Mason received much of present-day Maine and New Hampshire as a land grant from England. Settlement began the following year. In 1629, the two landowners divided their holdings at the Piscataqua River, Mason keeping New Hampshire and Gorges retaining Maine. Separated from the mainland by the back channel, the two islands which eventually became the site of the yard were originally called Puddington's Islands. Both were on the Maine side. John Puddington, the original owner, dried fish and repaired boats there in the 1640s. Ownership of the islands changed hands through the years. Later known as Fernald's Island and Savy's Island, they were separated by a narrow channel, Jenkins Gut, which ran between them. In the early 1900s, when Jenkins Gut was filled in, the two islands became the single island which exists today. Blessed by an abundance of raw materials, the early colonists in the Piscataqua region engaged in shipbuilding. Langdon's, later Badger's Island, another main island upstream and opposite Portsmouth, New Hampshire, became the favorite site of the early shipwrights. In 1690, the British government built the Falkland, a 54-gun frigate of the Royal Navy, which was the first authenticated warship built in the Piscataqua area. During the American Revolution, Badger's Island remained the headquarters for shipbuilding as its location fell within Portsmouth's harbor defenses. John Langdon, the Patriot leader, owned Badger's Island at this time. When the war began, he immediately offered its use for the American war effort. The America and the Ranger, among others, were built there. The shipyards on the island were less active after the war's end in 1783. Although they were never owned or designated as such by the new government, they served as America's unofficial Navy Yard until 1800. In 1798, Benjamin Stoddard, the Secretary of the Navy, sought to establish a government yard on the eastern seaboard. Basing his choices on a report prepared by Joshua Humphreys, the chief naval constructor, Stoddard recommended the purchase of Fernald's Island as the site for a navy yard. Owner John Langdon wanted $25,000 for Langdon's Island, which consisted of about 18 to 20 acres. Sidestepping Langdon's stubbornness, Stoddard paid $5,500 for the 58 acres of Fernald's Island. The date of acquisition was June 12, 1800, marking the yard's official beginning. Even at this lower price, the American government could not avoid the machinations of land speculators. The island had turned over twice since 1794 for quick profit. Fernald's Island quickly became known as Navy Yard Island. A two-story dwelling, later moved to higher ground, became the commandant's quarters. Until 1812, the yard was little more than a few sheds and workshops, together with the Marine barracks. Although the yard was actually across the Piscataqua on the main side, it was known from its inception as the Portsmouth Navy Yard. Official mail sent to this fledgling yard was addressed to the Portsmouth Navy Yard, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the location of the nearest post office. Maine was then a district of Massachusetts under whose jurisdiction Navy Yard Island belonged, and the village of Kittery had no postal service. The name and its address stuck. The War of 1812 generated much activity at the yard, with the repairing of the Wasp, Rattlesnake, and Enterprise. In 1815, the first ship of the new yard, the Washington, a 74-gun ship of the line, was launched. After the war ended in 1814, the yard slumped in a typical boom-and-bust cycle, to be oft repeated in the future. Post-war decline brought forth rumors that the yard was going to be closed. A 9-page petition, signed by Portsmouth's most prominent citizens, opposed this action. With John Langdon's signature heading the list, the petition, directed to Secretary of the Navy Benjamin W. Crowninshield in March 1816, summarizes the Yard's accomplishments and potential. Recent reports say that the Navy Bureau approbate the abolition of the Navy Yard at this place. Permit us to state such facts. This harbor combines advantages as superior to any other in the Union. Its vicinity to the ocean, the great depth of water, sufficient at low tides for first-rate ships, ever free from ice, and its natural situation so favorable that at no great expanse it may be rendered almost impregnable. The Navy Yard is on an island containing about 50 acres, the property of the United States. It is half a mile from town and 1.5 from the ocean. The improvements are 2 spacious timber docks, mast house, sail loft, store, blacksmith shop, gunner store, boatswain store, mold loft, barracks, commander's house, officer's quarters, office, hospital, magazine, and permanent slip-and-ways covered by a substantial ship house, sufficiently large to build within a 100-gun ship, also a wharf at which a ship of the line can lay with everything on board, get under way, and have from 6 to 10 fathoms to sea at low water. The country bordering on this river and Winnipesaukee Lake furnishes excellent white oak, Norway pine, spruce, and every species of timber that grows in New England. Mechanics in all branches of shipbuilding can be commanded in any number and at any time. The Washington bears incontestable evidence of their excellent workmanship, and the records of the accountant's office will prove at much less wages than in any part of the United States. After citing many economic and military advantages of the Portsmouth facility compared to those at Boston and at Norfolk, these New Hampshire businessmen concluded, "We have too much confidence in the wisdom and justice of our rulers to believe that they will give up this yard without particular enquiry into the advantages it possesses, which we think will furnish such facts as will ensure their fostering care, instead of abandoning so valuable an establishment." Whether or not Crowninshield responded to this petition is not known. However, the alarm of the Piscataqua region was stilled, as the yard was not closed. To ensure its future development, representatives and senators from New Hampshire, and shortly thereafter, those from the state of Maine, sent to Washington, staunchly promoted the yard's interests. This kind of support duly became expected of these delegations regardless of party affiliation. The 1st Congressional District of New Hampshire was known as, and remains, the Navy Yard District. Maine entered the Union in 1820. The following year, Maine ceded any right to jurisdiction held over Navy Yard Island, which was legally a federal reservation. The next 40 years of peace saw the erection of many new buildings and facilities. In 1838, a ship house was begun, and the structure was extended in 1854 to accommodate the building of the steam frigate Franklin. This building then became known as the Franklin Ship House, one of the largest buildings of its kind in the United States. During these years, one tradition started at the yard regarding an eccentric character. Jacob Mull was a sailing master until 1831, and then a yard employee from 1833 to 1847. He died in 1851. In 1840, after losing a bet of a glass of rum to Charlie McIntyre, another yard worker, Mull became the subject of a humorous and premature epitaph, and McIntyre's lines became part of the yard's lore, passed from one generation to another. "Here lies the rigging, spars, and hull of sailing master Jacob Mull. Where has he gone? No one can tell, but all suppose he has gone to hell. And if he cannot, curse and swear, he'll take no peace nor comfort there." The Civil War triggered a great shipbuilding boom from 1861 to 1865. 26 ships slid down the ways. The most famous was the Kearsarge, a steam sloop with 9 guns, launched in 1861. She sank the Confederate raider Alabama off the coast of France in 1864. To meet the sudden increase in construction and repair, the American government purchased Seaveys Island, about 105 acres, in 1866. The deal was finally closed for $105,000, with 28 partial owners. After the end of the war, the yard lapsed into a peacetime lull and reduced its workforce. In 1876, Congress actually debated the question of closing the yard. An appointed board looked into the matter, made recommendations, and advised against such action. To protect the yard during this long period of peace, 2 New Hampshire politicians came to the force in Washington. Frank Jones, Portsmouth's wealthy capitalist, was the representative from the Navy Yard District from 1875 to 1879. He was assigned to the Committee of Naval Affairs and worked diligently to promote his district's interests. He introduced appropriate bills in Congress and fought for their passage. In 1877, for example, Jones wanted to install a daffodil trumpet signal on Wales Blacklight, an island at the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor. A year later, Congress appropriated $15,000 for the signal and repairs to the lighthouse. During the administration of President Chester A. Arthur, 1881 to 1885, William E. Chandler of Concord served as Secretary of the Navy. Nicknamed the Stormy Petrel of New Hampshire politics, Chandler did not forget his native state. He and Arthur visited the yard in 1882. Chandler advised Congress in 1883 that the yard should be retained if for no other reason than as a supply station and arsenal. Although few vessels were built, the yard now became a major repair facility for existing ships. Throughout this time, yard employees from Portsmouth, by far the largest contingent, commuted to work from the Navy Yard landing at the foot of Daniel Street. Various Navy Yard ferry boats carried them across the Piscataqua. Among the well-known private ferries of that era were Skedaddle, Joe Hooker, and Ku Klux. Other workers used wherries, dories, whaleboats, yawls, seine boats, and even condemned government boats. As the yard entered the 20th century, modernization became more evident with each passing day. During the 1890s, New Hampshire Senators William E. Chandler and Jacob H. Gallinger introduced bills for a modern dry dock for the yard. Congress finally authorized its construction. The contract was awarded to John Pierce of New York for over $1 million in 1899. The site of this huge project was the channel of Jenkins Gut between Navy Yard and Seaveys Islands, filling the rest of the channel with excavated material made the two islands into one. The dry dock was completed in 1904. During the summer of 1905, Henderson's Point, extending off Seaveys Island and long a hindrance to navigation off the Piscataqua, was blasted away. An even more significant event that year brought the attention of the world to the Portsmouth Navy Yard. At the invitation of President Theodore Roosevelt, the plenipotentiaries of the empires of Russia and Japan arrived at the yard to negotiate the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Holding their sessions throughout the summer on the second floor of the new supply building, now known as Building 86, the delegates signed the Treaty of Portsmouth on September 5, 1905, to end the war. The establishment of a prison at the yard followed a protracted sequence of events. During the Spanish-American War, a tent colony on Seaveys Island served as a detention camp for over 1,600 Spanish prisoners of war. The prison ship, the USS Southery, came to the yard in 1903 and was anchored at a pier in the back channel. Housing American naval prisoners on board, she remained in service as a prison ship until the 1920s. In 1906, a paper battle ensued between the yard commandant and the Board of Health of Kittery over the yard piggery administered by the Southery. The former pronounced it sweet and clean, while the latter insisted the piggery was to be a menace to the health of Kittery. In 1908, the Navy built a prison, ultimately called the U.S. Naval Disciplinary Command. The castle, or the Rock, was an 8-story building and one of 30 buildings eventually built for this penal colony. Expansion continued. In 1910, a contract was let for construction of a new 134-bed hospital on Seaveys Island. It was needed, in part, to handle a serious problem. Just the year before, a cocaine ring had been exposed. A number of inmates at the prison and on the Southery were discovered to be using the drug. The Navy's campaign against the states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, the pharmacists of Portsmouth, and an individual smuggler was successful. New Hampshire established anti-cocaine laws. The pharmacists of Portsmouth combined an agreement not to sell the drug to enlisted men, and the smuggler was apprehended and punished. This era of expansion was highlighted by a visit to the yard on October 23, 1912, by President William H. Taft and Secretary of the Navy Philander C. Knox. The present steel bridge to Kittery, Gate No. 1, was completed in 1914 and included a railroad bridge. The hospital and access road had been completed in 1913. From locomotive cranes to the building of new shops and the expansion of old ones, the yard was both a self-sufficient community and a self-contained industrial operation by 1914. It was ready for any task it might be assigned. The growth of the yard paralleled the increasing importance of the submarine's part in the fleet of the United States Navy. Submarines and their torpedoes were vilified by early contemporaries. The history of the adoption of the torpedo as a recognized implement of warfare, wrote American journalist Allen D. Brown in 1882, is not unlike that of gunpowder or of shells. Each in its turn was met by the cry, inhuman, barbarous, and unchivalrous. To landlocked civilians, a submarine suggested a frightening and sinister weapon, shrouded in oily mystery, threatening friend and foe alike. Yet naval inventors and militarists have long recognized its two advantages: surprise and the ability to withdraw with relative safety from counterattack. Submarines, or torpedo boats as they were first called, have always fired Yankee imagination. In 1776, David Bushnell built the Turtle, the first submarine used in combat. This submarine prototype attempted to break the British blockade of New York Harbor. Later, in 1801, Robert Fulton built the Nautilus, which submerged using ballast tanks and a horizontal rudder, the world's first use of a diving plane. During the Civil War, the Confederate Hunley became the first submarine to sink a ship in combat. In 1864, she attacked the Federal warship Housatonic off Charleston Harbor. The explosion of the torpedo in the Housatonic's magazine sank both ships. The Union, in turn, sponsored the construction of the metal submarine Intelligent Whale from 1864 to 1872. This experiment was finally abandoned. Three widely separated developments soon spurred interest in the submarine's potential. The novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1870, by the French author Jules Verne, elicited international attention. The fictional Nautilus, commanded by Captain Nemo, revealed the submarine as a feasible combat weapon. In the 1860s, various inventors led by Robert Whitehead of England perfected the first self-propelled torpedo. By 1870, the problem of propulsion was solved. The electric storage battery, long under development, became efficient enough to power a propeller shaft. The battery required no surface air and could operate below the surface as well as on it. As European countries, especially France, encouraged private submarine builders for national defense, the United States Navy became interested in obtaining a sub for coastal defense. In 1888, after successfully competing against 6 other bidders, John P. Holland began work on the Plunger. The Navy Department and Congress frustrated his efforts by interfering in the financing and design. After wrangling over the Plunger's design, Holland exclaimed, "What will the Navy require next? That my boat should be able to climb a tree?" Finally, Holland abandoned the unfinished Plunger and began another submarine at his own expense. This craft was launched in 1897 and was powered on the surface by a gasoline engine and was submerged by battery-fed electric motors. The Navy purchased this submarine on April 11th, 1900, now observed as the official birthday of the submarine service. On October 12th, 1900, the Navy commissioned the submarine as USS Holland, or SS-1. As the first submarine, the Holland was assigned hull number SS-1, or Submarine 1, and later subs received hull numbers in order of their appearance. The Electric Boat Company, which had absorbed the major Holland patents by 1904, the Electric Boat Company, which had absorbed the major Holland patents by 1904, enjoyed a brief monopoly in submarine production. Known more familiarly as Electric Boat, or EB, this company first built subs at a subsidiary plant, the Four Rivers Shipbuilding Corporation, in Quincy, Massachusetts. Simon Lake, another pioneer inventor, entered the field with boats that were also powered by a gasoline engine and electric batteries. After competitive trials between Holland's Octopus and Simon Lake's experimental sub, the Lake, in 1907, the Navy decided to accept subs built to the designs of both men. In 1908, Simon Lake founded his own organization, the Lake Torpedo Company, on the Pequannock River, Bridgeport, Connecticut. An intense rivalry developed between the two companies. By 1912, both of these competitors abandoned gasoline engines, which made so much noise that they were called rock crushers. The gasoline engine, furthermore, were subject to leaking gas vapor and exhaust fumes, resulting in many dangerous or near disastrous explosions. The development and adoption of a heavy oil or diesel engine named after its inventor, Rudolf Diesel of Germany, solved this problem. During these early days, the submarine branch was hardly a sought-after billet in the Navy. Sailors on submarines did not receive increased pay because of hazardous duty. Submarines were nicknamed pig boats because, before the use of periscopes, they bobbed up and down like porpoises or sea pigs in order to attack. Many American naval officers were dissatisfied with the electric boat and lake submarines. They felt the Navy Department should exercise some control over submarine design and construction in order to build subs equal or superior to those being built by foreign nations. The time was right for the United States Navy to break the monopoly of private companies by building submarines to their own specifications within their own Navy yards. Strong lobbying in Washington during early 1914 secured the first submarine contract for the Portsmouth Navy Yard, which then constructed the L-8, the first government-built submarine. The national and state elections of 1912 saw the Democratic Party, led by Woodrow Wilson, taking advantage of the split between the regular Republicans under President Taft and Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose progressives. After Wilson's victory, in which he carried New Hampshire by exactly 56 votes, the president-elect selected Josephus Daniels of North Carolina to be Secretary of the Navy. New Hampshire reflected this national tide. The state legislature sent a Democrat to the Senate, while voters of the 1st District elected a Democrat to the House. These two men joined Senator Jacob H. Gallinger in Washington. Gallinger, a Concord physician, had been a Republican fixture in the Senate since 1891. These men, regardless of party affiliation, were united on the issue of more work for the yard. A fortuitous situation was developing in Washington on this very question. Although he had been a newspaperman and lacked experience in naval matters, Secretary of the Navy Daniels tackled his job with energy. He chose Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They began to institute many reforms in their department, as well as touring the government yards in 1913. The old method of having the Navy purchase submarines alarmed Daniels. "I thought that the only way to compel the two private submarine builders to make the best submarines at a reasonable price," Daniels wrote, "was to demonstrate that they could be built in a Navy yard." In addition to Portsmouth, the government yards on the East Coast at that time included Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Charleston. The Lake Torpedo Company, headed by Simon Lake, was in financial straits. Knowing the difficulties of Lake's company, Electric Boat wanted an exclusive contract for building submarines for the Navy. "I told him we had enough contracts to keep both yards busy," Daniels said to the persistent Electric Boat lobbyist, and the company he represented had been almost as unsatisfactory as the Lake Torpedo Company. Despite continual pressure, Daniels refused to give Electric Boat a monopoly, and in fact gave every encouragement to the Lake Torpedo Company to assure its survival. In Washington, during the spring of 1913, Daniels became acquainted with William E. Chandler, the stalwart of New Hampshire Republicanism and former Navy Secretary. Living there in retirement, the two men met at a party. "He had many anecdotes and incidents," Daniels wrote in his diary. Although differing politically, Chandler took a keen interest in Daniels' administration of the Navy and occasionally gave him public support. During the second session of the 63rd Congress in early 1914, the expectations of the Portsmouth Yard were dashed. "Only $10,000 allowed for this Navy yard," exclaimed one headline in the Portsmouth Herald. The town's leading newspaper, which was owned and edited by Fernando Wood Hartford. Born in upstate New York in 1872, F.W. Hartford had long been a booster and promoter for his adopted city, ultimately becoming mayor of Portsmouth in 1920 and serving 7 terms. Through his various political and business ventures, Hartford fell heir to the powerful role in Portsmouth's affairs once held by Frank Jones. Hartford also knew the yard well in the political setting in which it worked. As a young man, he had worked in the yard for several years, becoming the chief bookkeeper there at the age of 21. He also served as the chief clerk of the purchasing department and installed the Labor Board Employment Bureau. Maintaining a lifelong interest in the Navy and the yard, broken only by his death in 1938, Hartford employed his newspaper to push for various projects. While naval appropriations bills were in committee, Hartford's editorials vigorously supported the yard. Learning that Daniels was about to award a $525,000 contract for the building of a submarine to one of the government yards, Hartford headlined his front-page story for February 26th. "Here is our chance on shipwork. It can be safely said that Portsmouth has the advantage over the other stations," the Herald declared, "as the building can be carried out with extreme secrecy, and the work really done under lock and key in the Franklin Ship House." On March 5th, a meeting of the Portsmouth Board of Trade at the Rockingham Hotel in Portsmouth was well attended. President Thomas F. Flanagan of the Navy Yard Improvement Association spoke before the board and called attention to the association's effort to bring the sub-contract to Portsmouth. The Franklin Ship House, he maintained, was large enough to build 3 subs at the same time if necessary, and at reduced cost. A delegation was formed, and Commander Lawrence S. Adams, the industrial manager of the yard, who was experienced with sub-construction, supplied the necessary data. On Monday, March 9th, the lobbyists left for Washington, armed with satchels of papers, to present their case. In Washington, they first met with the New Hampshire congressional delegation, and undoubtedly with the Maine one as well, for a 2-state congressional bloc. Then the lobbyists met with Daniels and officials of his department to assure them that there would be practically no outlay to get ready for this work, and that the yard had the lowest overhead charges of any yard in the country. Daniels gave his approval. "Submarine to be built here," headlined the Herald's front page on Wednesday, March 11, 1914, and continued. "Good news for the Navy Yard employees." A telegram was reprinted. F.W. Hartford, Portsmouth, NH. Navy Department has decided to build the submarine at Portsmouth. Gallinger, a veteran of many naval appropriation bill battles, had won the day. The Herald claimed credit for its publicity and editorials, but Hartford was not satisfied. The next goal to be reached is the making of this yard a battleship base, the paper commented, and the wiping out of the crime committed when the yard was robbed of its battleship division. On March 16th, Daniels officially announced that submarine number 48, L8, was to be constructed by the government at Portsmouth. The sub was to follow plans approved for submarines L5, L6, and L7, built by the Lake Torpedo Company, with the necessary plans on June 29th. The awarding of the contract for the L8 signaled a new era for the yard. On June 30th, 1914, the statutes at large passed by the second session of the 63rd Congress included legislation against any further dealings by the private yards. One provision established the yard's bargaining power in the future, declaring, "Except where otherwise directed, the Secretary of the Navy shall build any of the vessels herein authorized in such navy yards as he may designate, should it reasonably appear that the persons, firms, or corporations, or the agents thereof, bidding for construction of any of said vessels have entered into any combination, agreement, or understanding, the effect, object, or purpose of which is to deprive the government of fair, open, and unrestricted competition, and let in contracts for the construction of any of said vessels." With the outbreak of war in Europe during the summer of 1914, the pace of the yard quickened. The Franklin Ship House was selected as the site for the sub's construction. Before the keel could be laid, much preliminary work had to be done. Materials had to be ordered, received, and assembled. The molds of the sub's hull took time to prepare. During December 1914, the hull division laid down the molds and began bending the keel. The year of 1915 found 1,150 employees at the yard. On February 1st, the Navy Department extended the industrial management system to the Portsmouth Navy Yard. This action separated strictly military aspects from the industrial functions. The commandant, a line officer, was in charge of the station and directed all military features. The industrial manager, either a naval constructor or an experienced engineering officer, assumed direct charge of the industrial work. In building the L8 and subsequent subs, Commander Lawrence S. Adams, the industrial manager, was free to devote his full energies to this purpose. Adams' responsibility was crucial to the United States government. The L-8 was one of 11 of the L-class submarines built by the Navy during 1915 to 1917. These boats were 165-foot, 456-ton submarines with diesel engines for surface propulsion. For armament, the L-boats had 4 torpedo tubes in the bow. A single 3-inch 23 caliber gun was mounted on deck for attacking small surface ships. The speed of the L-boats was relatively high, cruising at 14 knots on the surface with diesels and operating on electric motors at 10.5 knots while submerged. Her crew complement was 28 men. Even before the keel laying, Adams received some welcome news. The Navy decided to install a set of Edison batteries developed by the famed inventor Thomas Edison. Rigorously tested by the Navy Department, the batteries eliminated a number of unsatisfactory features of lead batteries. The chief advantage was the avoidance of chlorine gas, one of the most dreaded risks inherent in submarine service. Secretary Daniels also arranged for Rear Admiral David W. Taylor, the highly talented chief constructor of the Navy and chief of the Bureau of Construction and Repair, to visit Portsmouth. There, Taylor and Adams would personally confer on the progress of the new submarine. At 10 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday, February 24, 1915, the keel was laid for the L-8. A multitude of military and civilian officials, as well as visitors, attended the ceremony. They witnessed Captain Thomas Snowden, the head of the military department, and Adams drive the first rivet into the midship frame. The two men handled the riveting instruments like veterans. Work continued on the L-8 during 1915 and 1916. In the Franklin Ship House, the L-8 shared space with other subs under construction as well as with a dirigible balloon. The yard workforce swelled to 5,100 in 1917. Secretaries Daniels and Roosevelt visited the yard periodically on their inspection tours. The Riveter, an 11-stanza poem by Rose Viller, published in Life Buoy, the yard newspaper, captures the frenetic atmosphere during the building of the L-8. One verse reads, "Rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, you can hear it from morn till night. 'Tis the sound of the riveter's hammer at work, the cause of right against might." The L-8 was ready for her machinery within 11 months, but delay in its manufacture elsewhere postponed hope for her early launching. When the machinery finally arrived, in March of 1917, the yard workers installed it in record time. By building this submarine at Portsmouth, the Navy Department saved $52,000 in patterns and plans, as well as $80,000 more in general construction costs. The L-8, appropriated for $535,000, cost only $403,000. The United States entered the Great War on April 6, 1917, as crews were in the last stages of readying the submarine for launching. That evening, the Coast Guard stations and crews in Portsmouth District automatically transferred from the Treasury Department to Navy control. In the turmoil of these wartime developments, the launching was set for Monday, April 23rd, 1917. Heading the launching party of about 100 people was the sub-sponsor, Miss Nancy Gill, granddaughter of Commandant Howard. At 1 p.m., the party marched to a reviewing stand. The program included selections by the Navy Band and a prayer by the base chaplain. At 1:20 p.m., Miss Gill smashed a bottle, probably of champagne, against the pointed bow, exclaiming, "I christen thee L-8." The sub slid down the ways from the Franklin Ship House into the waters of the Piscataqua to the cheers of the crowd. The L-8 veered and brushed by the side of the old steam tug Pennacook. The tug immediately sprang a leak, and sailors stashed mattresses against the puncture while other crew members shifted the weight of the movable gear and equipment to the undamaged side to raise the height of the waterline above the break. The tug survived to pull another day, and the launching of the L-8 was now history. In an editorial, the Portsmouth Herald noted the significance of the event. On Monday, the men of the Portsmouth Navy Yard witnessed the actual advancement of our great naval station from a mere repair yard to a place among the construction yards in every sense of the word. The launching of the L-8 marks a new epoch in the life of this community. USS U-Boat L-8, a poem by R.J. Gilker, offered a tribute to the yard's first submarine. One stanza reads, "First U-boat built in a Navy yard of matchless strength and beauty great, to find an equal would be hard, of the submarine L-8. Before commissioning, additional work had to be done on the L-8. On May 26th, after 2 days spent testing the sub's equipment at berth in the yard, the L-8 sailed on her sea trials. Evers Bertner, a civilian from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, conducted metal strain tests of the L8 during her submergence. The hulls of early American submarines were riveted. Welding technology was not developed enough to assure hull strength. "I was in the boat off the Isle of Shoals to make measurements," Bertner said, indicating the structure was strong enough for naval requirements. The L8 made a 200-foot dive in about 250 feet of water and lowered a 500-pound mushroom anchor. The torpedo hatch over the battery compartment leaked salt water a little, Bertner said. With further lowering, the gasket over the hatch sealed, and there was no more leaking. For half an hour, Bertner made measurements with his gauges to collect data for a written report. The riveted hull withstood the strain. Satisfied, Bertner gave his findings to the captain. The sub then blew her ballast tanks, weighed anchor, and returned to the Navy Yard. On August 30th, 1917, the L8 was commissioned with Lieutenant James Parker Jr. in command. The L8 began training operations along the East Coast. Once she started to enter an Atlantic port, the name was not disclosed due to wartime security measures. Stopped by a patrol boat, the L8 did not respond to various signals relating to nationality and other information. Without the proper code and signal flags, the L8 risked being treated as an enemy vessel. The patrol boat then fired a shot as the men on deck of the L8 made a lively scurry and waved flags. There was a tense moment before she was finally recognized. On October 20th, 1918, the L8, part of the four-boat contingent of Submarine Division 6, left Charleston, South Carolina for patrol duty in the Azores. The division arrived there on November 7th. At sea, when the war ended, the L8 reached Bermuda on November 13th and was then ordered to return to the United States. The L8 was Portsmouth's only sub involved in active combat service during the Great War. The shifted emphasis in the yard's role from a repair facility for service ships to full-fledged submarine yard increased as the war continued. 4 extra building ways for submarines, together with cranes, were constructed. During the period of 1917 through 1918, workers laid the keels of 6 more submarines. By the war's end, this trend could not be reversed. In 1923, the Navy Department, designating officially what had been a reality for years, named Portsmouth a submarine yard. From fewer than 2,000 employees before the war began, the yard peaked at 5,722 in October of 1918. About 1,000 of the workers were women. During the war period, some 51 new buildings were erected and additions put on to existing structures. On August 26, 1916, $6 million was appropriated for equipping the yard for construction work. Women served in the Navy in a new capacity. The first detachment of Lady Yeomen arrived in April 1917. These business school graduates joined the Naval Reserve as stenographers, replacing men required for duty in other branches of the service. For the building of submarines, security and secrecy around the yard were absolutely essential. Large signs saying, "Beware of spies," were posted in various shops. Below this warning, each sign read, "Don't talk about what you are doing or are going to. The enemy has ears everywhere," and so forth. The yard relied heavily on civilians for technical assistance. Evers Bertner left his teaching duties at MIT to work as a draftsman on the second floor of one of the new building-ways structures. There was an intense special course during the war period at MIT, Bertner said, to train electrical, civil, mechanical, and agricultural engineers in the marine fundamentals. After completion of this special course, they were hired at the yard as inspectors and draftsmen. If one were qualified, an ensignship was offered. Under the direction of Robert J. Boyd, the chief draftsman, these recent college graduates were engaged in the drafting of plans for submarines. Many left their drafting tables during the noon hour to eat a bag lunch they carried with them to work. After lunch, one draftsman returned to discover an overturned ink bottle and a large black blot on the plans he had been meticulously laboring over. "Scared the chap," Butner said. On closer inspection, the anguished man found a dry bottle with a black piece of paper cut to imitate a blot. He had fallen for an old draftsman's prank. Washington officials visited the yard throughout this war period. On Sunday, September 2nd, 1917, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt arrived for an informal visit with Commandant Howard. "The war has shown that the Portsmouth and Boston Navy Yards," Roosevelt said upon his return to Washington, "must be maintained as they are absolutely necessary to our naval defense." Secretary Daniels appeared a number of times. The popularity he had gained in Portsmouth naval circles for awarding the L8 contract had waned. By General Order 99 on June 30th, 1914, Daniels abolished officers' wine messes aboard all vessels. The Navy brass felt insulted. As a song of the day put it, "Brian, he drinks grape juice, and Daniels likes it well. They'll make the Navy drink it. They will like hell." After the first resentment wore off, the new order was actually a relief. Alcoholism never became a serious problem in the Navy. With sophisticated submarines using increasingly intricate machinery and equipment requiring the most sober and expert handling, alcohol had no place in the life of officers and seamen, whether they were at sea or in port. On October 31st, 1918, Daniels appeared in a surprise visit and addressed more than 5,000 employees from the steps of the Commandant's quarters. He was enthusiastically received, and applause interrupted his remarks repeatedly. Daniels said, "Some people are asking the question. If this war is over soon, they ask whether the Navy will go back to a little small concern and whether the great naval work will continue. The answer I can make to that question is this. Last week, the President of the United States sent to Congress recommendations for a 3-year building program, which will be the biggest building program any nation ever entered upon. We're going to build it, boys, whether the war ends or the war does not." After hearing this good news, the yard employees gave Daniels 3 rousing cheers. The progress of the 01, the yard's second submarine, exemplified this wartime spirit. Launched from the Franklin Ship House on July 9th, 1918, "will soon be outdoing her bit against the Huns," in the words of Life Buoy. The submarine went on her sea trials on November 5th, considerably ahead of schedule. The news of the armistice on November 11th, 1918, arrived in Portsmouth around 3 a.m. About 10 minutes after the State Department made the official announcement in Washington, the war was over. Workmen at the yard quickly received the news. "The place went crazy. Impromptu parade started up," said Wilma Bill Letch, a machinist helper. "The yard got a half day off. No work could have been done, anyway, under such conditions of excitement." The end of Chapter 1. On October 20